When I opened my door and saw two cops standing next to that HOA witch with her smug victory smile, I knew right then that today would either be the worst day of my life or the absolute best. They had no idea that the shotguns they wanted to confiscate weren't just regular hunting weapons, and they definitely didn't know that I wasn't some nobody photographer they could easily push around. But before I tell you about that explosive moment, I need to fill you in on how Jessica Hartwell turned my peaceful life into a deadly game. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I guarantee you'll want to stick around to see the surprises waiting ahead. The thing about living in Willowbrook Estate is that you're supposed to feel safe, but lately I'd been getting this creeping sensation that someone was always watching me. Every time I loaded my camera equipment into my truck, I'd catch glimpses of curtains twitching across the street. When I'd return from weekend hunting trips, neighbors who used to wave would suddenly find their gardens incredibly fascinating. It wasn't paranoia, it was the kind of systematic surveillance I'd learned to recognize during my 12 years as a Marine, and now in my current work as a federal wildlife inspector, operating under the cover of being a freelance photographer. What made it worse was the growing realization that this wasn't random curiosity. Someone was deliberately coordinating these observations, and that someone had resources and motivation that went far beyond normal neighborhood nosiness. My name is Albert Thompson, and 3 months ago I thought I had the perfect setup. Willowbrook Estate was a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Colorado Springs, where people minded their own business and left you alone to live your life. I'd moved here specifically because it was the kind of place where a guy could maintain his cover story without drawing unwanted attention. My neighbors knew me as that polite photographer who kept to himself, drove a beat-up pickup loaded with expensive camera gear, and occasionally disappeared for long weekends to shoot wildlife in the mountains. What they didn't know was that those photography trips were actually federal surveillance operations targeting illegal wildlife trafficking rings throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The surveillance I'd been feeling ramped up after Jessica Hartwell got elected as the new HOA president 6 months ago. Jessica was 30 years old, recently unemployed after getting fired from some real estate company, and apparently had decided that running our homeowners association was going to be her path to power and relevance. The first sign of trouble came when she started showing up at community events, wearing the most ridiculous outfits, like that bright yellow crop top paired with gray pajama pants that she somehow thought qualified as appropriate public attire. But it wasn't her fashion sense that worried me. It was the way she'd started taking notes about everyone's activities and asking pointed questions about people's work schedules and weekend habits. My first direct encounter with Jessica happened on a Tuesday afternoon when she showed up at my door unannounced, clipboard in hand and that fake smile plastered across her face. "Hi there, I'm Jessica Hartwell, your new HOA president," she announced, like she was running for mayor of the entire city. "I'm doing comprehensive neighborhood assessments to identify opportunities for community improvement and safety enhancement." The way she over-enunciated every word made it sound like she was reading from a script she'd memorized from some community leadership seminar. I could immediately tell this woman was going to be trouble, but I figured I'd play nice and get rid of her quickly. "Nice to meet you, Jessica. I'm Albert. If you need any paperwork filled out, just drop it in my mailbox." I started to close the door, but she stepped forward, craning her neck to look past me into my house. Her eyes were scanning everything like she was conducting some kind of security assessment. "Oh, I couldn't help but notice you have quite a lot of expensive equipment. Are you running some kind of business operation out of your home? Because we have very specific zoning regulations about commercial activities in residential areas." The way she said it wasn't a friendly neighbor asking about my hobbies. It was an interrogation disguised as small talk, and something about her intensity made my federal training kick in with warning signals. "I do nature photography," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Sometimes that involves camping and hunting, so I have outdoor gear." Jessica's eyes lit up like she'd just hit the jackpot. She pulled out her phone and started typing notes with the enthusiasm of a detective who'd just found a smoking gun. "Hunting? With actual firearms? In our family-oriented community?" She looked up from her phone with that same predatory smile. "I hope you're aware that Willowbrook Estate has very strict policies about weapons storage and activities that might impact community safety and property values." There was something in her tone that went beyond normal HOA authority. This felt personal, like she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my response professional. "All my firearms are legally registered and properly stored according to federal regulations. I haven't violated any community standards." Jessica tilted her head like she was analyzing my answer for weak spots. Of course, of course. I'm sure everything is perfectly legal. I just like to stay informed about potential safety concerns and ensure all residents are following proper protocols. She took several steps back and started photographing my house with her phone, making no effort to hide what she was doing. Just documenting the neighborhood for our safety assessment, you understand. The way she said it made it clear that she didn't care whether I understood or not. She was building some kind of case, and I was about to become her primary target. After she left, I watched through my window as she stopped at the end of my driveway and made what appeared to be a lengthy phone call, occasionally pointing back toward my house and gesturing animatedly. That bright yellow crop top made her look like a traffic cone, but there was nothing comical about the systematic way she was documenting everything she could see. I dealt with enough hostile surveillance in my federal work to recognize when someone was building a case against you, and Jessica Hartwell had just declared herself my personal intelligence analyst. The next morning brought confirmation that my instincts were correct when I found an official-looking letter slipped under my door, printed on letterhead that read, Willowbrook Estate Homeowners Association, protecting our community through responsible leadership. Jessica had just fired the first shot in what was about to become a very costly war. I stared at Jessica's ridiculous letter for a solid 10 minutes, reading it 3 times to fully appreciate the audacity of what she was attempting. She was demanding that I surrender my legally owned firearms for inspection by the Homeowners Association, as if the HOA had magically acquired law enforcement powers overnight. The letter even included a veiled threat about community safety concerns and property value impacts that could result from my non-compliance. It was obvious that Jessica had spent considerable time crafting this document, probably researching legal terminology online to make it sound as official and intimidating as possible. But what really caught my attention was how quickly she'd escalated from casual questioning to formal demands. Most people take weeks or months to work up to this level of confrontation, but Jessica had gone from 0 to full-scale harassment in less than 24 hours. I decided to do some research on my new nemesis before responding to her ultimatum. A quick online search revealed that Jessica Hartwell had been fired from Pinnacle Realty 8 months earlier for what the local business journal diplomatically described as persistent interpersonal conflicts with clients and colleagues. According to her LinkedIn profile, which she'd apparently forgotten to update, she'd bounced between several sales positions over the past 3 years, with each job lasting shorter than the previous one. Her social media accounts painted a picture of someone desperately trying to project success and authority, while obviously struggling with unemployment and personal setbacks. What made her online presence particularly revealing was her recent posts about finally having the opportunity to make real changes, and showing people what effective leadership looks like. But what really caught my eye was a post from 2 weeks earlier, where she'd written about dealing with difficult residents who don't understand community standards, and how she was prepared to take whatever action necessary to protect our neighborhood values. The comments section revealed that she'd already had conflicts with several neighbors, including someone named Karen Brennan, who'd written, "Please remember that good leadership means serving the community, not controlling it." Jessica had responded with multiple angry emojis and the comment, "Some people just don't understand what it takes to maintain community standards." I made a mental note to find Karen Brennan. Anyone who'd already challenged Jessica's authority might prove to be a valuable ally in whatever was coming next. Rather than responding immediately to Jessica's letter, I decided to let her stew in her own anticipation while I gathered more intelligence about her methods and motivations. I spent the afternoon discreetly observing the neighborhood and quickly identified several houses where Jessica had made multiple visits over the past week. I also noticed that she'd recruited at least 2 neighbors to help monitor my activities. An elderly man across the street who'd started photographing my truck whenever I loaded equipment, and a middle-aged woman who'd begun walking her dog past my house multiple times per day, always with her phone ready to record. The surveillance was amateurish and obvious, but it demonstrated that Jessica was thinking strategically about building her case against me. That evening, Jessica decided to escalate the situation by showing up at my door again, this time with backup. She brought along a thin, nervous-looking man in his 50s who introduced himself as Robert Chen, the HOA treasurer. Both of them were dressed like they were attending a board meeting, with Jessica wearing a wrinkled business suit over that same bright yellow crop top, creating a bizarre contrast between her attempt at professionalism and her complete lack of actual authority. "Mr. Thompson, we're here to discuss your response to our community safety notice," Jessica announced, holding up a folder that I assumed contained more pseudo-legal documents. Robert Chen looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, but Jessica clearly had him convinced that this was official HOA business. I haven't decided how to respond yet, I replied, deliberately keeping my tone casual and unhurried. Jessica's eye twitched with irritation at my refusal to be intimidated. Mr. Thompson, we're trying to be reasonable here, but community safety is our top priority. We have residents who are concerned about the presence of military-grade weapons in a residential neighborhood. I almost laughed out loud at her description of my hunting rifles as military-grade weapons, but I maintained my composure. All my firearms are legally owned hunting rifles and shotguns. They're properly registered and stored according to federal regulations. Jessica stepped closer, her voice taking on a more aggressive tone. That's exactly the kind of defensive attitude that concerns us. Why won't you just cooperate with a simple safety inspection? Robert Chen shifted uncomfortably and tried to interject some reasonableness into the conversation. Perhaps we could schedule a time for you to show us your storage setup, just to put everyone's minds at ease, but Jessica cut him off with a sharp look that made it clear who was really in charge of this little delegation. Mr. Chen, we've already established our position. Mr. Thompson needs to comply with our safety inspection requirements within the specified time frame. She turned back to me with that fake smile that was becoming increasingly strained. We're not asking for anything unreasonable, just a quick inspection to verify that everything meets community standards. I decided it was time to push back a little and see how Jessica handled direct resistance. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not comfortable with non-law enforcement personnel inspecting my private property. If you have specific safety concerns, I'd suggest you contact the appropriate authorities. Jessica's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought she might actually explode right there on my doorstep. We are the appropriate authorities for this community, Mr. Thompson. The Homeowners Association has broad powers to ensure community safety and property values. Her voice was rising with each word, and I could see Robert Chen looking increasingly uncomfortable with her aggressive approach, an obvious misunderstanding of HOA authority. Actually, Jessica, I don't think that's accurate, I said quietly. The HOA has authority over common areas and architectural standards, but not over legally owned personal property inside private homes. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times as she tried to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal her complete ignorance of actual HOA legal authority. Finally, she fell back on the nuclear option that I'd been expecting all along. If you don't comply with our reasonable safety requirements, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement and potentially initiate legal proceedings to protect the community. The threat was delivered with all the drama she could muster, but I could see the desperation behind her bravado. She'd painted herself into a corner and now had to follow through on increasingly extreme escalations. After they left, I watched Jessica pace back and forth in my driveway for several minutes, making animated phone calls and gesturing toward my house like she was coordinating some kind of military operation. Robert Chen looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear, but Jessica was clearly energized by the confrontation. She'd drawn her line in the sand and was now committed to a course of action that was going to require her to continually escalate until she either won or destroyed herself in the process. Based on what I'd learned about her personality and background, I was betting on self-destruction. But I also knew that desperate people can be dangerous, and Jessica Hartwell was about to become very desperate indeed. The next morning brought the inevitable escalation I'd been expecting, but it came faster and more aggressively than even I had anticipated. I was in my home office when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, followed by heavy footsteps and multiple voices heading toward my front door. Through the window, I could see a police cruiser parked behind Jessica's beat-up Honda, and my heart rate spiked as I realized she'd made good on her threat to involve law enforcement. This wasn't just harassment anymore. She was now actively interfering with federal operations, and the implications were potentially catastrophic for both my investigation and my personal safety. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Officer Brad Chen, a young cop who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him stood Jessica, practically vibrating with excitement and wearing her signature yellow crop top like a uniform of authority. She had her phone out and ready to record, clearly expecting this to be the moment of my public humiliation. "Good morning, sir. I'm Officer Chen with Colorado Springs PD. We received multiple reports about potential weapons violations and concerning behavior at this address. I need to ask you a few questions and possibly take a look around." Officer Chen declined Jessica's attempt to join our conversation inside, which clearly frustrated her, but she positioned herself outside my window where she could monitor everything. The young officer's demeanor changed as I showed him my photography equipment and firearms documentation. "Can you tell me exactly what concerns brought this to your attention?" I asked. "Well, we received reports about military-style weapons and possible surveillance activities," he replied, looking embarrassed. I had to suppress a laugh at Jessica's creative interpretation of my telephoto lenses as surveillance equipment. That's when I made a calculated decision to reveal just enough about my background to establish credibility. "Officer, I served 12 years in the Marines before transitioning to civilian work. I take firearms safety extremely seriously." His attitude shifted immediately when I mentioned military service. "What kind of work are you doing now?" I gestured toward my equipment. "Wildlife photography, sometimes for government contracts. It's quiet work that lets me spend time outdoors after years in urban deployments." This was technically true. My federal investigation work did involve nature photography. By the time we finished, Officer Chen had figured out Jessica's complaint was baseless. When we stepped outside, Jessica was pacing frantically, clearly upset that her orchestrated confrontation wasn't proceeding according to script. "But what about the military weapons?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. "What about the surveillance equipment?" Officer Chen maintained his composure, but his patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, Mr. Thompson has standard hunting rifles and professional photography equipment. Everything is properly registered and legally compliant." Jessica's reaction was immediate and explosive. She started arguing with Officer Chen, insisting he hadn't looked carefully enough and demanding a more thorough search. Her yellow crop top was getting disheveled as she gestured wildly, and neighbors began gathering at windows to watch the spectacle. "You're not taking this seriously," she shouted. "This man is a threat to our community." Officer Chen's expression hardened as Jessica challenged his authority. "Ma'am, I've conducted a thorough investigation. If you have concerns about actual illegal activities, file a formal complaint through proper channels. I cannot conduct searches without probable cause." But Jessica wasn't finished. As Officer Chen prepared to leave, she stepped directly in front of his patrol car, blocking his path. "I'm not letting you leave until you do your job properly. Search his house. Confiscate those weapons." Her voice was getting more hysterical by the second. Officer Chen's radio crackled as dispatch asked about his status, and I could see him calculating whether the situation was about to require backup. "Ma'am, you need to step away from my vehicle immediately, or I'll have to consider this interference with a police officer." The threat of being arrested seemed to snap Jessica back to reality momentarily, but as she moved away from the car, she turned toward me with pure rage. "This isn't over, Albert. I know what you're hiding, and I'm going to expose you." She pointed her finger directly at me, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "You think you can intimidate everyone with your military background, but I'm not afraid of you. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are." The venom in her voice was shocking, even for someone who'd been systematically harassing me for weeks. That evening brought an unexpected visit from Karen Brennan, who knocked on my door carrying homemade cookies and wearing an expression of genuine anger about what she'd witnessed. "Albert, I wanted to apologize for today's circus and warn you about what you're dealing with," she said, glancing around nervously. What Jessica did today was exactly her playbook. She did the same thing to the Rodriguez family, except they didn't have your composure. They ended up screaming back at her, which she recorded and used as evidence of their instability. Karen explained that Jessica's confrontation with Officer Chen had actually been more restrained than usual because she was performing for a larger audience. "Here's what you need to know," Karen continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Jessica has been planning something bigger for you. She told Mrs. Patterson that you were just the beginning and that she was going to clean up this entire neighborhood, starting with dangerous residents like you. She's not just targeting you randomly. She sees you as some kind of test case for what she can get away with." Karen's warning sent chills down my spine because it confirmed that Jessica's harassment wasn't just personal vindictiveness. It was part of a larger campaign to establish dominance over the entire community through fear and intimidation. "There's more," Karen said, pulling out her phone. "She's been recruiting Mrs. Chen across the street, Mr. Rodriguez next to the park, and at least 3 other families have been approached about joining what she calls the Community Safety Initiative. She's telling people that law enforcement won't protect them, so they need to take matters into their own hands." The implications were terrifying. Jessica was essentially building a vigilante network with herself as the leader, using me as the perfect villain to justify increasingly extreme actions against anyone who didn't conform to her vision of community standards. As Karen prepared to leave, she turned back with one final warning that would prove prophetic. "Albert, Jessica is done playing games. After today's humiliation with Officer Chen, she's going to escalate beyond anything she's tried before. Whatever you're really doing here, whatever your real story is, you need to be prepared for her to go nuclear. She'd rather destroy this entire neighborhood than admit she was wrong about you. Karen's assessment was spot on. Jessica had crossed a line today that she couldn't uncross, and her next move was going to force me into a corner where maintaining my cover would become impossible. What happened next was unlike anything I'd experienced in my years of federal work. Jessica didn't just escalate her harassment, she transformed it into psychological warfare designed to destroy my sanity and force me out of the neighborhood. Within 48 hours of her humiliation with Officer Chen, she had launched a comprehensive campaign to turn every aspect of my daily life into a nightmare of surveillance and social isolation. Jessica flooded the neighborhood group chat with urgent safety alerts about me, posting screenshots of my truck and claiming to have identified suspicious patterns in my schedule. She shared photos of my photography equipment taken through windows, describing telephoto lenses as surveillance tools, and creating a detailed timeline of my activities with speculation about what I might be planning. Most disturbing was how she recruited her community safety team, neighbors who agreed to monitor my activities in exchange for being included in her inner circle of authority. The psychological pressure affected me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Patterson began logging everyone who visited my house, writing down license plates and photographing visitors. Mr. Kowalski started working in his yard whenever I was outside, phone ready to record. They worked in shifts, ensuring someone was always watching during daylight hours. I found myself checking federal protocols constantly, worried that amateur surveillance might compromise my investigation. 3 days into Jessica's campaign, the situation turned darker when I returned from assignment to find my garbage scattered across my lawn, but mixed with planted evidence. Empty ammunition boxes that weren't mine, printed photos of weapons I'd never seen, and a fake business card for a non-existent private security company. Jessica was obviously planting evidence to support whatever narrative she was building, and the sophistication worried me more than I cared to admit. That evening, Mike Sullivan appeared at my fence, looking genuinely alarmed. "Albert, we need to talk immediately," he said, glancing around nervously. "Jessica came to my house with a folder of evidence about you, asking if I thought you posed a threat to neighborhood children. When I told her she was being ridiculous, she said disturbing things about taking matters into her own hands if law enforcement wouldn't act." His legal training had helped him recognize that Jessica's behavior was crossing into criminal territory. "She mentioned contacting some kind of private security company about investigating your activities," Mike continued in a whisper. "She also asked about citizens' arrest laws and whether homeowners associations had authority to detain suspicious individuals." The implications were chilling. Jessica wasn't just planning more harassment, she was considering physical confrontation or illegal detention. The most disturbing development came when someone attempted to break into my garage during the night. My security system recorded a figure in dark clothing trying to pick the lock around 3 a.m. When I reported the attempted break-in, the responding officer mentioned they had received several calls about suspicious activity at my address, all from Jessica's phone number. That afternoon brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. I was loading equipment when Jessica appeared with 2 men I didn't recognize. One appeared ex-military with obvious authority. The other looked like a private investigator. "Albert Thompson," Jessica called out loudly, "we need to have a conversation about your activities and their impact on community safety." "We represent the Willowbrook Safety Committee," the older man announced. "We've received numerous complaints about potential illegal activities at this address, and we're conducting an independent investigation on behalf of concerned residents." I recognized the tactic. Jessica had recruited outside help to give her harassment an official veneer, but these men looked competent and professional, unlike her amateur neighborhood spies. If she'd hired actual investigators, my federal cover could be in serious jeopardy. The situation was spiraling beyond anything I'd encountered, and I realized Jessica had crossed a line that would force me to choose between maintaining my cover and protecting my investigation. As the 3 of them stood at my driveway making demands about inspecting my property, I knew the psychological war Jessica had started was about to become something much more dangerous, and my days of passive resistance were officially over. 4 weeks later, Jessica made the catastrophic mistake that would destroy her completely. I was in my office when multiple vehicles arrived with car doors slamming and radio chatter. Serious law enforcement response. Through my window, I saw a sheriff's patrol car, unmarked sedan, and Jessica's Honda. She was bouncing with excitement in that yellow crop top, phone recording what she expected to be my arrest. Deputy Rodriguez stood at my door with search documentation, accompanied by a detective. Mr. Thompson, we've received multiple reports about weapons violations and suspicious activities. We need to discuss the situation and potentially search your premises. I knew maintaining my cover was no longer possible. Jessica's escalation had forced my hand. I had to reveal my federal status to protect my investigation. Deputy Rodriguez, I need to show you something that will completely change this conversation, I said, retrieving my federal credentials. I'm Special Agent Albert Thompson with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, investigating illegal wildlife trafficking operations. The weapons and equipment you're here to inspect are federal property and evidence in an ongoing investigation. The change was immediate and dramatic. Deputy Rodriguez's demeanor shifted to genuine alarm about interfering with federal operations. Behind him, Jessica's expression went from eager anticipation to confusion to dawning horror. I need to verify this with your supervisors immediately, Rodriguez said, voice tight with concern. If this is accurate, we have a serious problem. While Rodriguez made urgent calls, I explained, I've been operating undercover as a photographer for 14 months, conducting surveillance on trafficking networks. Ms. Hartwell's harassment has been documented, but involving local law enforcement now threatens a federal investigation. Jessica tried to interrupt, but Rodriguez ordered her to wait by her vehicle. Within 20 minutes, confirmation came from his supervisor who'd spoken with my section chief. Agent Thompson, I apologize on behalf of the Sheriff's Department. We were operating on false information. Ms. Hartwell's complaints appear without merit and we may have interfered with federal operations. When Rodriguez explained to Jessica, I watched her world collapse. She started screaming that I was lying about being a federal agent and demanding real proof. Her voice got higher and more desperate as he explained she'd filed false reports and interfered with federal operations. The authoritative persona she'd maintained crumbled, leaving exactly what she was, a petty tyrant who'd picked an impossible fight. But Jessica's meltdown wasn't over. As the vehicles prepared to leave, she ran toward my house screaming, "This is all fake! He's lying! He's not a federal agent! He's just some crazy veteran!" She was crying now, mascara running, yellow crop top disheveled. "You have to believe me. I've been protecting this neighborhood. He's the dangerous one." Rodriguez tried calming her, but Jessica was beyond reason. "I demand to see his real credentials. This is a conspiracy. He's been planning this. He's been watching all of us." The irony wasn't lost. She was describing exactly what she'd been doing to me for months. But now, with my federal status revealed, every false report, every harassment campaign, every lie was about to destroy her. As patrol cars finally left, Jessica stood in my driveway staring with pure rage and disbelief. Her entire campaign had collapsed spectacularly, and she was beginning to understand she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd declared war on a federal agent with unlimited resources for retaliation, and now she was about to discover exactly what those resources could do to someone who'd systematically interfered with federal law enforcement operations. The neighborhood went silent, dozens of residents watching from windows as Jessica stood alone in that ridiculous outfit, her authority scattered like debris from an explosion. She'd spent months convincing everyone I was the dangerous threat to their safety. Now they witnessed the moment her house of cards collapsed, and the real threat to their community was finally revealed. The woman in the bright yellow crop top who'd terrorized them all with manufactured authority and systematic abuse of power. The morning after my federal status was revealed, I made a decision that would end Jessica Hartwell's reign of terror permanently. She had spent months systematically harassing me and other residents, using her HOA position to abuse anyone who didn't bow to her demands. She had escalated to filing false police reports and interfering with federal operations. Now it was time for her to face consequences that would destroy her completely. And I was going to make sure she understood exactly what happens when you declare war on someone with federal authority and unlimited resources for retaliation. My first call was to Mike Sullivan, who was immediately excited when I explained that my federal status opened up entirely new categories of legal destruction. "Albert, if you're willing to go public with your credentials, we can build a case that goes far beyond neighbor disputes," Mike said, his voice filled with the excitement of a constitutional lawyer who'd just been handed the perfect test case. We're looking at federal civil rights violations, systematic harassment, defamation, interference with government operations, and serious criminal charges for filing false reports. We can destroy her completely and set a precedent that protects future victims. Within 48 hours, Mike had prepared a comprehensive federal lawsuit that would bankrupt Jessica for life. The lawsuit demanded her immediate removal from all HOA positions, $50,000 in damages to my federal investigation, legal fees, and a permanent restraining order. We also filed criminal complaints with the district attorney's office, and federal prosecutors expressed serious interest in charges for obstruction of justice and interference with federal operations. Jessica was about to face the full weight of the federal government, and she had no idea what was coming. But before the legal papers were even filed, Jessica's world began collapsing in ways that were more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. Within hours of word spreading about my federal status, neighbors who had been afraid to speak out began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. Karen Brennan organized the Willowbrook Justice Committee to coordinate additional complaints. The social media group Jessica had created to attack me was suddenly flooded with posts from residents, sharing their own experiences with her systematic targeting and intimidation. Jessica's attempts at damage control only made everything worse. She posted increasingly frantic messages claiming I was using federal authority to intimidate civilians and that the lawsuit was government retaliation for free speech. But her credibility was destroyed, and every post just provided more evidence of her unstable mental state. Her yellow crop top and pajama pants, which had once seemed like quirky fashion choices, now looked like clear indicators of someone completely unfit for any position of responsibility. The most satisfying development came when multiple government agencies began taking active interest in Jessica's activities. My federal supervisor reported her interference to appropriate authorities, and the county sheriff's department opened an internal review of her false reports. The state attorney general launched an inquiry into HOA abuse of power, using Jessica's case as an example of systematic harassment that violated civil rights. Even the IRS became interested when they discovered she'd been using HOA funds for her harassment campaign. But the real destruction began when Jessica's personal life started collapsing as rapidly as her public persona. Her husband, who had been working night shifts and was largely unaware of her activities, finally learned the full extent of what she'd been doing when he was served with legal papers at his workplace. According to neighborhood gossip, he was horrified to discover that his wife had been terrorizing neighbors, filing false police reports, and interfering with federal law enforcement while he was supporting their household. Within 10 days of the lawsuit being filed, Jessica's husband had moved out and filed for divorce, citing embarrassment and fear of legal liability. The speed of Jessica's downfall was remarkable. One week she was the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estate, the next she was facing federal charges, multiple lawsuits, divorce proceedings, and complete social isolation. Her desperate calls to Mike's office became increasingly pathetic as she tried to negotiate settlements that would make the consequences disappear. Jessica's final, desperate move came when she showed up at my door one last time, but now she looked like a completely different person. Gone was the arrogant HOA president in her signature outfit. Instead, I saw a broken woman in rumpled clothes, eyes red from crying, begging me to make it all go away. "Please, Albert," she sobbed. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Can't we just forget about all this?" But I had learned from her own playbook that mercy is wasted on people who have demonstrated they'll use any power to hurt others systematically. "Jessica," I said quietly, "you had months to show mercy when I was trying to live peacefully. You chose harassment, false reports, and interference with federal operations. You showed no concern for the families you destroyed or the damage you caused. Now you want mercy because you're finally facing consequences?" She started crying harder, but I continued. "You taught me an important lesson about power and accountability. Now you're going to learn that same lesson, and it's going to cost you everything you have." When her lawyer called for the 6th time that week begging for a settlement conference, I had Mike deliver a message that would seal her fate completely. Jessica had shown no mercy when I was vulnerable, and she would receive absolutely none now that federal law enforcement was involved. The game was over, but her destruction was just beginning, and I was going to make sure she faced every possible consequence for her systematic abuse of power and terrorizing of innocent families. 8 months after Jessica Hartwell first knocked on my door, with her clipboard and fake smile, I sat in Judge Sandra Martinez's federal courtroom, watching her face the full consequences of her systematic campaign of harassment and abuse. Jessica was dressed in a conservative black suit that her lawyer had obviously insisted upon, but she still managed to look completely out of place in the formal legal setting. Judge Martinez was a no-nonsense federal judge in her late 40s, with a well-deserved reputation for taking civil rights violations and harassment cases very seriously, and she had clearly read through all the evidence we'd presented with growing disapproval and concern. The case had attracted significant attention from local media because of the federal law enforcement angle and the unprecedented nature of Jessica's systematic abuse of HOA authority. Court TV had even sent a reporter to cover what they were calling a landmark case in homeowner association abuse of power. Several neighbors testified about Jessica's pattern of harassment, including the Rodriguez family, who had been forced to sell their house after Jessica's campaign against their fence color, and the Thompsons, who had moved to another state rather than continue dealing with her systematic targeting of their landscaping choices. Aaron Brennan presented documentation of over 40 separate incidents where Jessica had abused her authority to target residents who didn't immediately comply with her demands or show what she considered appropriate deference to her position. Mike Sullivan had compiled a comprehensive timeline showing how Jessica's harassment had escalated from simple complaints to false police reports to interference with federal operations, demonstrating a clear pattern of increasingly dangerous and illegal behavior that posed a genuine threat to community safety and individual rights. Judge Martinez was particularly harsh in her assessment of Jessica's conduct and motivations. Ms. Hartwell, the evidence presented in this case demonstrates a systematic pattern of harassment, abuse of authority, and reckless disregard for both your neighbor's constitutional rights and federal law enforcement operations, she said, looking directly at Jessica with obvious disapproval. Your actions represent a fundamental perversion of what community leadership and service should mean. You have used your position not to serve your neighbors, but to terrorize and control them for your own psychological gratification. The financial judgment was devastating for Jessica and would effectively bankrupt her. Judge Martinez awarded me $55,000 in damages, covering lost federal contract time, compromised investigation costs, equipment damage, legal fees, and emotional distress. Jessica was also ordered to pay legal fees and damages for several other neighbors who had joined the lawsuit, bringing her total financial liability to over $80,000. The federal court also issued a permanent restraining order, preventing her from any contact with me or interference with my work, and banned her from serving in any HOA leadership position for 20 years. The criminal charges were equally serious and far-reaching. The district attorney's office had filed multiple charges related to Jessica's false police reports, harassment, and interference with federal operations. She ultimately pled guilty to several misdemeanor charges and one federal felony charge of obstruction of justice, receiving 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, and substantial additional fine. The criminal conviction meant she would be permanently barred from many types of employment and would face significant challenges in rebuilding any kind of normal life. The impact on Jessica's remaining personal life was complete and irreversible. Her divorce had been finalized while the criminal case was pending, with her husband receiving their house and most of their assets, since Jessica's legal debts made it impossible for her to maintain any property ownership. She was forced to move to a small apartment in a rundown part of town and take whatever employment she could find that didn't require background checks. The last I heard, she was working as a night shift cleaner at an office building, a job that kept her away from other people and gave her plenty of time to think about the consequences of her actions. The transformation of Willowbrook Estate was remarkable and immediate. With Jessica removed from power and facing criminal charges, the neighborhood returned to the quiet, peaceful community it had been before her reign of terror. The HOA board was completely restructured, with new leadership focused on actual community maintenance rather than social control and harassment. I was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, and our first order of business was establishing a comprehensive residents' rights charter that would prevent future abuse of authority and ensure that HOA power could never again be used to systematically target individual residents. 1 year after the federal court case was concluded, I was driving through downtown Colorado Springs when I spotted a familiar figure in a bright yellow crop top pushing a shopping cart full of cleaning supplies toward a rundown office building. Jessica Hartwell looked older, more tired, and completely defeated as she struggled with her cart, wearing that same ridiculous outfit that had once made her look like a traffic cone with delusions of grandeur. She glanced up as my truck passed by, and the look of recognition, shame, and complete defeat in her eyes was more satisfying than any revenge I could have planned. The final irony was that Jessica's obsessive campaign against me had actually helped my federal investigation succeed beyond our original expectations. Her systematic documentation of neighborhood activities had inadvertently captured evidence of several residents who were involved in the wildlife trafficking ring I'd been investigating. Her interference had initially threatened my cover, but ultimately provided crucial evidence that helped us build stronger cases against the trafficking network. I received a commendation from the Director of Fish and Wildlife Service for maintaining operational security under extreme civilian harassment and successfully completing one of the most complex investigations in the agency's recent history. As I finish telling this story, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important victory isn't personal satisfaction, but creating systemic change that protects others from experiencing the same abuse and harassment. Jessica Hartwell spent over a year systematically terrorizing neighbors who couldn't defend themselves against her campaign of harassment and intimidation. But when she finally picked the wrong target, her entire house of cards collapsed, and an entire community was freed from her toxic leadership and abuse of power. Sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't fight back. And sometimes, the best photographs are the ones that capture the moment when justice finally comes into perfect focus, and the people who abuse their power face the consequences they've been avoiding for far too long. The neighborhood is peaceful now, filled with people who can pursue their hobbies and live their lives without fear of arbitrary harassment from petty tyrants who mistake control for leadership. That's a picture worth taking and a story worth telling.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.